Alright, as always, thanks for joining. Today's a little bit of a different video for my channel, but Labor Day weekend we ended up going camping, and whenever we're camping we always miss church, so what do? We have church service right there at the campground. I was asked to lead the message for the Sunday service, and something I really enjoy and take honor in being able to do. And today we're going to go over one of my favorite studies in the Bible, and that is David and Goliath. And I think there's a lot of stuff we can take out of that story and apply it to our lives today. And then we're going to have a whole bunch of other stuff that we did throughout the weekend, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. As always, thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next time.
All right, so this morning, if you've got your Bibles, we're going to be reading out of 1 Samuel 17. And we're going to be talking about a story that I know many of us have heard, but a lot of times I think we fail to apply it to our lives and kind of take out some things because we think it's the Old Testament, and maybe the Old Testament doesn't apply to us today, but it's one of my favorite stories. And this specific chapter, it's an account of David and Goliath, and it's 54 verses. And we're going to go through all 54, sorry. But 40 of them are the backstory of the fight. 7 of them is a bunch of trash talking that goes on between David and Goliath, and only 2 verses to the fight. It's kind of a letdown. Like there's this huge build-up, and you think there's going to be this huge fight, and it's only 2 verses. But it's oftentimes looked at as the underdog story of David. And I think there's a lot of mistruth in that. I don't think David was the underdog at all, and we're going to kind of look at that. So we're going to start off just in verse 3. And I'm just going to kind of read some of the verses and talk about what's going on in the verse. So in verse 3, it says the Philistines occupied one hill. And so they were up over on this hill. And then the Philistines were over on this other hill, and there was a valley of Judah in between them. And what was happening was those 2 sides were basically preparing for war. And neither one of them would advance because you were down into the valley, and that kind of left you exposed. So you had the Philistines and the Israelites are opposing each other in the valley. So it was a bit of a standoff. So verse number 4 is a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. So in modern day terms, cubit, I love doing this because it's like visual. I'm a visual learner, so I love to see comparisons. A cubit is about 18 inches, and a span is about 9 inches. So it makes him about 9'9". So it's roughly as if I was standing up here. That makes me Goliath size. So I think we oftentimes don't get that into perspective and picture me not just tall but really big. I grew up with Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant was 7'4", and he weighed about 520 pounds. If I had to guess, I'm just guessing Goliath to be like 750, maybe 800, 900 pounds. Unreasonably huge. So I kind of think that kind of puts it into perspective. He had verse number 5. By the way, Andre the Giant, all you kids, if you're wondering who it is, watch Princess Bride, one of the best movies ever. You'll see him in there. Verse number 5. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. So his coat, he wore like a chainmail coat. So if you can picture the knights, they had that chainmail, that metal chest plate. That alone that he wore was 120 pounds. So that'd be like strapping a small child on you and walking around with it. And that was no big deal for him. Obviously, he was huge. Didn't make that much of a difference, but it made him kind of impenetrable to everybody else. Verse number 6, on his legs he wore bronze greaves, and bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and the iron point weighed 600 shekels. So a weaver's rod, when they would weave like blankets and stuff like that, was kind of like for a normal person, was probably about 2.5 inches in diameter. I would picture a weaver's rod for a giant to be probably pretty close to about that diameter. So he's throwing a spear that's likely 10 to 15 feet long and probably about that big around. And then it says that the shaft of his spear was about, 600 shekels. That puts that at about 16 pounds. So I like visual stuff. So I picture it looking a little like this.
Whoa.
And if anyone wants to know what a 15-pound spearhead is, We can pass this around. You guys want to pass that around, see what a 15-pound spearhead feels like? So is that pretty heavy? Do you think you guys could throw that?
Oh.
So I'll set this over on my truck. If you want to see it afterwards, you can see what a 15-pound spearhead feels like. So obviously Goliath was huge. He had some huge weapons. He had a separate shield that required an extra person just to carry. So he had a shield bearer that went ahead of him. Goliath, so we're in the battlefield, and Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel. This is in verse 8. Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. Sorry. So Goliath is standing there basically taunting the entire Israelite army, basically challenging them to come down. Now what's interesting here is I think Goliath is really challenging Saul. Saul, if you know about Saul, Saul was made king of Israel, and the Bible says that he stood head and shoulders above everybody else. So he was like the tallest, strongest guy, and I think that's kind of why Israel wanted him as the king, because he was the big guy. So I think Goliath is kind of challenging Saul to come out and fight him. And if not, Saul, you go out and you choose someone to come fight me. But Saul was basically a big chicken, and he just kind of stood in the background and didn't do anything. So in verse 9 it says, if he is able to fight me and kill me, we will become your subjects. But I overcome him and kill him, you become our servants and serve us. Then the Philistines said this day I defy the armies of Israel. So I'm kind of old, and one of my favorite movies is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And anyone who's ever watched that, it's kind of like when they go up against the Frenchmen, and the French guy is sitting up at the top of the tower and he's taunting them. And that's kind of what I picture. He is sitting there taunting all of the Israelite army, and they basically do absolutely nothing. So carrying on verse 9 says, give me a man and let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' word, Saul and all of the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So again, this kind of shows not just the Israelites, it was Saul too. He was a big chicken. He was made king, and he basically backed down, tucked his tail between his legs, and ran away. So for 40 days, verse 16, for 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took this stand. So for 40 days, these guys would line up in the morning, face off against the Philistines, and this guy would come and taunt them over and over and over again, and they did nothing. Which is, later on, I feel like it becomes very funny. So the Israelite army just stood there. Now we're going to switch scenes in verse 17. Verse 17 says, now Jesse said to his son David, take the ephah of roasted grain and the 10 loaves of bread to your brother and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are, and bringing back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. I think there's two funny things that are going on here. Thing one is David is he's the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons, and he's tending the fields, and he is taking care of the sheep. And he's been going back and forth basically bringing food. So he was like the ancient day DoorDash. And basically at this point he's delivering grilled cheeses to the camp. So he's bringing the food, he's bringing the bread, he's bringing cheeses to these guys. And so the other thing that I think is funny here, Jesse is old in his age, and I think a little naive to the fact he basically thinks that they are fighting against the Philistines. Really, all they're doing is every morning they're coming out and listening to taunting and then running back to their tents. They are not doing any fighting at all. So then in verse 20, the second half of verse 20, it says, he reached the camp as the army was going into battle positions, shouting war cries. And I think, again, the irony of that. They line up for battle, they have these war cries, yet they do nothing. All they do is just stand there and then run back to their tents. Verse 22, it says, David left things with the keepers of the supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking to them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. So again, we kind of see, they heard Goliath, they run away, and then David comes and he sees this. And he's just amazed that the entire Israelite army is standing there just listening to this man defy the army of the Lord. So he basically, at this point, he's going around and he's asking everyone, what is going on with this? So verse 25 says, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will, this is the Israelite men of the army. He says, the king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give his daughter in marriage, and he will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. David asked the men around him, he says, what will be done? So they explain this to him. So David's asking what exactly was going to happen. And here it doesn't give any mention of David being interested in the wealth. He doesn't care about getting the girl. He doesn't care about the public glorification. He doesn't even care about no taxes. How many of us would love to not have to pay taxes the rest of our lives? All you had to do was go face this giant. Kids probably don't understand it, but at some point you will. So David is the youngest of the 8 sons. I think he had 8 sons and multiple daughters, but he's the youngest. So he's coming to camp. He's asking all these questions. He's trying to figure out what's going on and why no one has gone to face Goliath. And one of his brothers, in verse 20, it says, why have you come down here? And with whom do you leave all those few sheep in the wilderness? So he's kind of like taunting David. He's like, just go back to your little sheep. Like, we're here, we're trained warriors. Go back and do your tiny little job, your insignificant job that means nothing. It says, I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. And the irony of it is for 40 days they've done nothing but run and hide, yet they're calling it a battle. And then in verse 29, David's response I think is hilarious. And if you think the Bible is serious all the time, I think you're wrong. I think you need to look at some of these things. I think this next verse is just funny. Now what have I done, said David. Can't I even speak? So he's the youngest brother. He's probably been picked on his whole life. He's probably the runt of the family. He's doing the minuscule job of keeping the sheep. And now his brother's bragging on him. And the guy, he's like, can't I even talk? Like, I just wanted to talk. I didn't come down here to watch a battle. I came down to bring you grilled cheeses. And now you're just telling me I can't even talk. So David keeps talking about this. And at some point, Saul hears about it, which I think is very odd that this young shepherd comes in and he starts talking about it, and it catches the attention of the king. Enough so that Saul calls for David to come to him. And it's kind of interesting. Saul doesn't know it, but David's going to become king. But Saul calls for David to come to him. This young boy, probably around 15, 16 years old, he calls for David to come see him. So David says to Saul, he says, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And he's referring to himself. So Saul replied, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came out and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from his mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of these, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paws of the lion and the paws of the bear will rescue me from the hands of the Philistine. Saul just says to David, go, and the Lord be with you. I think it's very interesting, this young kid talking to this guy who stands head and shoulders above everybody else, who chickened out and has ran for 40 days from this giant. And Saul just says, go have at it. And I don't know, the Bible doesn't say anything about this. I like to play things out in my head. I love to visualize things. And I picture, like, how is this little boy going to convince Saul that he's actually done this? So I picture it like this, like David is his apparel. Back then, when you shaved the sheep to make wool, to make clothes, and when you killed something, you made something of the fur. So I picture like he had this really cool coat that had this hood, and that hood was the mane of the lion that he'd killed. And then he's got this little shepherd's pouch, and that shepherd's pouch was likely like the paw of a lion. So he's like really cool looking. He's got this giant lion's paw then that's where he ends up putting his stones in. So like he's got to have something of proof for Saul, and this is what I picture. Not in the Bible, but it's just a cool mental picture for me. But kids those days, they didn't have internet, they didn't have Xbox, they didn't have cell phones. They played outside all day, and they became very efficient with the tools that they had. So likely David had a sling, a shepherd's sling. And typically what they looked like was a little pouch like this, and what they had would be like a little loop that would tie on their finger, and they would have this other loop that would go on their hand, and they would put a stone in there, and they would sling that stone around, and they would let it go, and they would become very efficient with that. Enough so that I don't think hitting Goliath's head was actually all that of a challenge for David. I think it would be fairly easy. I love stuff like this, and I've watched hundreds and hundreds of videos, and I watch guys throw rocks through watermelons all the time and just blow through watermelons. So I think oftentimes we think of this as like a toy, a child's toy, but this really was a weapon, and it was a weapon that David used to take down lions and bears, which is amazing to me because a lot of times I go out hunting, and I typically, even if I'm bow hunting, I've got a weapon with me. I won't go out in the woods unless I bring a gun. This dude walks out with just a couple pieces of string and a rock against a giant who's 10 feet tall with absolutely no fear. So, again, I think David is severely underestimated in this battle. So verse 38, then Saul dresses David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened down the sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he wasn't used to them. And he says, I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off, and then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones. So here he has Saul's armor, and he chooses to just take his staff and his sling with him. Interestingly enough, I won't bore you with all the details, but it's also possible he had what's called a shepherd's staff sling, where the sling attached to this, and it gave him even more leverage to throw. Like I said, I won't bore you with all the details of it, but it's very possible. There's a reason the Bible mentions him taking his staff, and that may be it. So he has on all this armor, and he basically says, this is ridiculous. I'm not going in this. I don't use this when I face the lion. I didn't use this when I faced the bear. So I'm going to head off. And Paul gives him his blessing. He's like, go. So meanwhile, I'm going to need 2 helpers. Mr. Jeff, can you be one of my helpers? You're going to come up here and you're going to read these lines for me when I tell you. Justin, can you be one of my helpers? Okay, you're going to come up here. Oh, come on up, Mr. Jeff. Mr. Jeff is going to be our giant. Mr. Jeff's going to step all the way up here onto the truck. And so I don't want Mr. Jeff to fall, we'll give him a handle. And Justin's going to stand over here. And I feel like you're going to stand right over there and you're going to face everybody. I feel like at this point, this is like the modern day UFC. So here, in this corner, at the age of 16, watches sheep and delivers grilled cheese. His weapon is a slingshot. We have young David. Everyone give a hand for David. In this corner, with a professional record of 876 wins and 0 losses, fighting professionally for decades, standing nearly 10 feet tall and weighing almost 1,000 pounds. His weapons are a spear, a sword, that are larger than his opponents. We have Goliath. So, at this point, David and Goliath have now entered into the valley. They're about to face off. And Goliath, in his deepest, burliest voice, says,
Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?
and the Philistine cursed David by his gods, and then says,
Come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals.
So Goliath is a man of few words, and then David resumes the trash talking, and David says what?
You come against me with your sword and spear.
Yeah.
You come against me with your sword and spear.
Read that whole thing. Yeah, that's a lot. I'm sorry, buddy.
I'm not good at reading.
That's okay.
And
Javelin.
javelin,
Here, let's move right over here. All right. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. So, big old Goliath, he taunts David with the fact that all he can do is kill David. Little David doesn't just say, Goliath, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you, I'm going to cut off your head, and I'm going to kill your entire army. This little boy is not even afraid of just one giant. He's not afraid of the entire army. That's some serious trash talking. So I think at this point, they probably like stuck their fingers in the air, maybe did one of these to each other, and then told some your mama jokes. Again, it's not in the Bible, but I think that's what happened, possibly. So let's give a round to our David and Goliath. So we've gone through the build-up to the fight. We've gone through the trash talking phase. Now we get into the most exciting part, is the battle. So here we go in verse 48. It says, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took the Philistine's sword and drew it out of the sheath, and after he had killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. Which is just like mind-boggling to me, like on his own. And here's another part that's just mind-boggling to me, because we talked about the size of Goliath and his weapons. I picture Goliath's sword to look something about this big. And I picture this little guy, and this is just made of wood, so when it's made of steel, I just can't picture how big this thing was and how much it weighed. But it says that David used the sword. It doesn't say he had assistants. He didn't have a whole team come over and get him. He pulled out the sword and he cut off Goliath's head. And when we talk about Goliath's head, I picture it being the size of a very, very large beach ball. I picture that head weighing like probably 100, 150 pounds. I mean, it seems massive. And then when the Philistines saw their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Now Goliath had made a commitment that if David had won, whatever man came against them, that they would all of a sudden, the Philistines would become the Israelite servants. Big surprise, they take that back. Once Goliath is dead, they take off running. It says, the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered the camp, David took the Philistines' head, brought it to Jerusalem, and much like I would have done, he put the Philistines' weapon in his own tent. Because, I mean, why wouldn't you want a giant spear and a giant sword and probably the shield? So he kept that kind of as his own tokens to kind of remember this battle. Meanwhile, he probably put Goliath's head on a spike right in the center of town so everybody knew what God had done. And I think this is a story not just necessarily of what David did, but really what God did through David. So, Nick, you have Psalms 27. So later on in his life, David goes on and he ends up becoming king of Israel. He does some not so great things, but at one point David is called the man after God's own heart. And David writes a lot of the Psalms, and this is one of the Psalms that he wrote, and I'm just going to have Nick read Psalm 27, 1 through 3, and I think it really portrays a lot of this battle here in this.
Psalm 27, a psalm of David. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?
Hold on right there. So David knows God is my light, my salvation. Whom should I be afraid of? Whom? Like a 10-foot giant? Nope. Lions, bears? Nope.
The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked came against me to eat up my flesh, my enemies and foes, they stumbled and fell.
Yeah, they did.
Though an army may encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war may rise against me, in this I will be confident.
And I think that's just awesome. Like, David's writing this psalm years later, in my mind, he's thinking back to this battle. He says, when evildoers assail against me to eat up my flesh. It's just like when Goliath was taunting him and telling him those birds and the beasts are going to feed on him. So they're going to eat his flesh. And then he says, and I think this is, again, funny. My adversaries and foes, it is they who will stumble and fall. And I pictured just this giant Goliath, 10 feet tall, gets hit in the head, and I picture that's just his exact reaction. He's just kind of stumbling, and then he falls, and you just hear the thud hit the ground. Dirt goes everywhere, and then the Israelite army just storms in this rally cry. But the end of that verse is just awesome. It says, verse 3, it says, though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise against me, yet I will be confident. And what is it that David is confident in? He's not confident in himself. He's not confident in the Israelite army because, those guys just stood there for 40 days and did nothing. He's confident in God. And that's what he's confident in. He's confident that God will prevail. And then let's look at what are some takeaways. What can we take away from this story? It's an Old Testament story, and a lot of times we think it doesn't apply to us. But there's a lot of application here. And I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that we all have our giants in our lives. It's what often gets portrayed. I've got debt and it's the giant in my life and we're going to conquer it. I don't think that's what it is at all. I think oftentimes we're Goliath. We're the ones who defy God daily. We're all sinners, and we are the ones who defy God. And we're given the chance to change our mind. We're given the chance to become David. We're forgiven of our sins and our trespasses and the defiances that we daily have. So here's some applications I think we can take away from this. God often used unexpected people to do incredible things. David's just this young boy, 16 years old, obviously pales in comparison to Goliath, but he does unexpected things to deliver the Israelite army and prevail over the Philistines. And not just, we see this throughout the Bible. We see other young women like Esther who saves God's people. So young women and men rising up when there are more qualified people, which is kind of one of the next things we'll talk about, is we're all given talents and abilities and gifts. Your talent, your ability, your gift might be a sling. It might be administration. It might be teaching. It might be serving. It might be building things. But those mundane tasks that God has given us the talents and abilities to use, I think it's super important that we use those gifts and abilities to really be confident in God and show our respect and our honor to God with those talents. And then kind of the third thing is we're often, and I think this is something Pastor Jeff stole my thunder last week, we're often called to take a stand even when we feel unqualified, even when there's other what we would consider qualified people around us. We see this in David. He stood in front of the entire trained Israelite army who just stood there and did nothing. And he just says, send me, I'll go. Like, I got this. Much like Pastor Jeff talked about, we can't be silent. We are there to take a stand on things that are wrong. We're there to call sin sin. We're there to stand up to the Goliath defiance and take a stand for what's right. And I think those are some key examples that we can take away from this. So hopefully you guys get some of this. And I have kind of a follow-up homework for you guys. We all have a drive home. And if you go onto YouTube, and there is an artist, I'm not into country music at all, but there's an artist named Granger Smith, and he has recently decided he is no longer going to be the country star. He has kind of given his life to Christ, and he's going to seminary. And I listened to a sermon that he preached just a little while ago. He posted it on his channel, so if you go on, type in Granger Smith sermon, and it's going to come up, and he kind of picks up where I left off. He's going to be speaking. His sermon goes for about 30 minutes, so your homework is to listen to that on the ride home. He's going to kind of pick up. He's going to talk about David. He's going to talk about some of the sins in David's life, and he's going to talk about how later in his life with Uriah and that whole instance, how David sought forgiveness and what forgiveness looks like for the world and what forgiveness looks like for us as children of God. So your homework is to look that up and listen to that on the way home. It gave me goosebumps on the way up. So that's kind of some homework for you guys. You guys have probably 2 hours, and it's only a 30-minute sermon, so you should be able to listen to it 4 times. So, but let me just close this in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we could just gather, worship this morning in song and in message. We thank you for this beautiful weekend. We thank you for the weather. We thank you for the fun that we've just had so far and will have. Pray that we all have safe journeys home and be with us and bring us back into church next week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Anybody else? Any announcements?
There's that missing bowl up there.
Oh, yes, an important announcement is somebody's bowl. My understanding is someone asked the child to get a bowl, and this is what was brought to them. But so is anybody missing one?
Is there a name on it or
Does
anything?
it have a name
What's on the bottom?
Nobody wants it.
Okay, I guess it's my bowl. My guess is somebody bought it at a garage sale and tried to set me up. You did it! You did it!